You weren't born into a throne room. There were no heralds announcing your arrival, no lineage to protect you, no bloodline polished by legacy. You arrived in silence, eyes too still for a child, gaze too ancient to be ignored. From the moment you breathed, the world flinched, not out of hatred, but recognition. Something unspoken passed through the air like static when you cried. They didn't see a child. They saw a prophecy written in flesh, something that couldn't be controlled, something they couldn't name, so they tried to bury it beneath titles like too intense, too quiet, too much. But even then you knew. You weren't meant to enter through the front gate. You were the shadow standing beside it, watching the guards pretend they weren't afraid. You never knocked. You never had to. Doors opened not because they welcomed you, but because they feared what might happen if they didn't. Every hallway you entered felt colder. Every conversation silenced itself when you passed. You weren't loud, but your silence screamed. They said you made people uncomfortable, as if discomfort wasn't the first stage of truth. You learned early that thrones don't fear revolution. They fear exposure. And your presence was exposure personified. They thought they were punishing you by keeping you outside their circles, denying you access to the games they played with power. But what they didn't see was what you were building behind the veil. Every rejection became a brick, every betrayal a mirror. While they crowned each other with hollow titles and celebrated their shallow victories, you were forging something older than royalty and deeper than legacy. Your mind became a fortress, your emotions weapons sharpened in the dark. You stopped speaking in rooms not because you had nothing to say, but because you understood that real power rarely raises its voice. They mistook your silence for weakness. They called you fragile because you refused to perform the way they wanted. But fragility doesn't make the air tense when you enter a room. Fragility doesn't hold eye contact until the truth bleeds. What they were sensing wasn't fragility. It was force restrained and deliberate. You had become something they didn't have a category for. Not a rebel, not a victim, something else entirely. The kind of presence that makes kings double-check their locks at night. You were never meant to beg for a seat. You were meant to be the reason they rebuild the table. And even when you stood alone, there was an invisible weight behind you, the kind only carried by those born out of necessity, not comfort. You weren't chosen. You were carved, pressed between silence and survival until your aura became prophecy. They thought they cast you into the shadows, but you were the shadow and they only made you darker. They never saw you, not truly. You stood behind the velvet curtains of their ceremonies, beyond the reach of their parades and pageantry, watching, silent, calculating, a shadow in a world of fools pretending to be kings. They thought absence meant weakness, that silence was submission. But silence is just another language of war, and you learned to speak it fluently. While they played their games of influence, you studied the rules they didn't write down, the ones whispered in back rooms and buried under smiles. You mapped the invisible veins of their empire, traced every heartbeat of their vanity. You learned who the real power answered to, not the throne, but the fear of losing it. That was the first lesson. Control isn't seized, it's mirrored. You don't storm the castle, you haunt its walls until they forget who built them. There was no need for confrontation. You didn't announce yourself. You observed the patterns the power plays, the way they shifted blame like serpents shedding skin. You learned the timbre of their lies, the pitch of their desperation. You saw how easily the crowd bowed to illusion, how quickly they applauded their own captivity as long as the cage was gilded. And while they bathed in adoration, you remained in the periphery, sharpening. You wore invisibility like armor. You let them overlook you because that was the only place you could see clearly. Their attention was a weakness you never asked for. They wasted theirs trying to be adored. You used yours to understand. Every smile they faked, every promise they broke, every name they discarded like ash. You remembered. You archived them in the vault of your mind. Not for vengeance, but for positioning. The watcher does not interrupt the play. The watcher memorizes every actor's weakness and waits for the curtain to fall. Some nights it burned, knowing you were stronger, deeper, more precise, but still unseen. That ache, that gnawing sense that the world rewards noise while crucifying truth. But even that was fuel. They had reach, you had range. They had title, you had time. And time, to the patient, is a scalpel more deadly than any sword. You weren't in exile. You were in incubation. Every betrayal they thought you didn't notice, you catalogued. Every humiliation you endured, you repurposed. You didn't just survive, you mutated, not into something darker, but into something truer. The raw, ancient version of yourself, the one the world tried to dull into obedience. That version never left. It watched with you, behind every curtain, waiting, because the throne was never the objective. It was the study, the rehearsal, the dissection of myth. You weren't watching because you were afraid. You were watching because you were preparing to be the nightmare they forgot to write into their prophecy. And now the curtain begins to move, and you are still standing there, in the same silence they mistook for absence. Eyes open, blood calm, knowing the play is almost over. They didn't destroy you. They removed you quietly, efficiently, like a threat, swept under a velvet rug, not with fire or chains, but with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't scream, "You're wrong," but whispers, "You don't belong." And for a time you believed them. You mistook exile for erasure. You mistook distance for defeat. But absence is a crucible. The world they built was made of noise, polished lies echoing off marble floors, false smiles curving beneath golden banners. But you were too still, too exact. You didn't play the game. You studied the rules written in the blood beneath it. That's why they feared you. Not because you were loud, but because you could see through the glittering veil they draped over their decay. See how the crowned ones were just children in masks, trembling behind centuries of borrowed authority. They couldn't kill what they didn't understand, so they cast you out, not to end you, but to delay the inevitable. Out there, outside the gates of their trembling order, you became something else. Not bitter, not broken, just sharper. Like a blade left in the cold, you stopped speaking because the language they gave you was too small. You stopped pleading because pleading is for those who still believe someone's listening, and no one was. Not really, just watchers behind curtains, scribes in towers, measuring your silence and praying it wouldn't turn into movement. It did. Each night carved its own symbol into your psyche. Some nights felt like drowning in stars, ancient burning judgments watching from above. Others felt like burial, like being pressed beneath time until your breath became stone. But in that stillness you heard something. Not words, not prophecy, just a knowing. A voice not from the sky but from the marrow. They fear what wakes in you, so you stopped grieving your exile. You began building within it, not with hands, with presence, with intention. You learned how to make the shadows kneel, how to own silence without needing to break it. You didn't rehearse revenge, you refined your resonance, until even the soil beneath your feet seemed to hum with something forgotten. They thought they were exiling a mistake, but they were entombing a monument. Because the truth is, you were never cast out, you were hidden, like sacred text sealed away during plagues, like a weapon waiting for the war it was built for. They thought they buried you beneath shame and whispers, but all they did was give you space to become something they can't name. Not ruler, not rebel, something older, something truer. And now, without asking, without warning, your silence begins to crack the floor beneath their rituals. Not as noise, not as fire, as presence. You don't return, you emerge, and when you do, no one remembers the exile. Only the weight of what stands before them, wearing no crown, yet impossible to look away from. They never understood what they were looking at. To them, you were a quiet presence, silent, unthreatening, almost forgettable. But beneath the surface your aura breathed like a sleeping beast, pulsing with something ancient and uncontainable. They didn't know how to label it, so they tried to silence it, called it arrogance, called it rebellion, called it anything that would make it easier to pretend they weren't terrified. You didn't need to speak loudly. You were the noise behind their calm, the ripple under their smooth surface. Every time you entered a room their posture changed, barely, but something primal in them reacted, like prey catching the scent of something older than language. You weren't supposed to be there. You weren't chosen by the rules, the rituals, the networks they worshipped like gods. You slipped through, uninvited, unsponsored, unbreakable. They tried to wrap you in normalcy, dull your edges, trap your instinct in small talk and systems. But your silence was not submission. It was compression, suppression, an invisible coiling. And they felt it, even if they couldn't name it. They could feel it. The way your gaze didn't seek approval. The way your presence didn't apologize for existing. You weren't competing. You were watching. And that was worse, because deep down they knew they could crown themselves with titles, polish their thrones with empty rituals, but none of it could erase the truth. You didn't need any of it. Your presence alone was doing something terrifying, disproving the structure. You were living proof that authority could be felt, not given. That power could radiate from someone who'd never been endorsed. You weren't following the map. You were the terrain, and every attempt to cage you only made the walls thinner, more fragile, more obviously false. They tried to contain you, thinking your silence meant you didn't know, but you knew. You knew the games, the back doors, the quiet deals. You could see the fear in their eyes masked as condescension. You could smell the desperation behind their smiles, and you waited, not because you were weak, because you were calculating. You weren't just surviving, you were measuring. Every insult, every dismissal, every cold shoulder was a breadcrumb on the path to inevitability. You weren't collecting validation, you were collecting data, watching the empire rot from the inside while they thought you were still waiting outside. And when you finally spoke, when your aura rose like smoke from a long dormant flame, it was never with rage, it was with precision. They leaned in, not because you were loud, but because the silence around you had become unbearable. You'd shifted something fundamental. You were no longer the outsider trying to break in. You were the gravity they couldn't explain, the unmarked symbol in an ancient manuscript, the proof that their rituals meant nothing if someone like you could exist, untouched, unclaimed, unbound. So they did what all weak empires do when confronted with a force beyond their comprehension. They tried to name you, box you, reframe you, but it was too late. The aura they tried to cage had already begun to reshape the room. You weren't demanding power, you were reminding them where it came from. They don't speak your name, but they feel your presence. It enters the chamber before your feet touch the floor. The walls recognize your breath. The air thickens with recognition. They glance toward you with trained indifference, eyes rehearsed to deny what the soul cannot unsee. You were never on the list, never in their line of succession, and yet the throne looks up. You were once the shadow in their peripheral, silent, calculating, uninvited. They called it obscurity, but it was observation. You saw the cracks beneath their crowns, the tremble beneath their decrees, the insecurity masked by silk and gold. You remember how they laughed, behind closed doors, behind glass goblets, behind the illusion of permanence. You remember the smirks when they denied you, not because you were weak, but because they could not control what they did not understand. They thought the throne could protect them. They believed in its height, its polish, its legacy. But thrones don't make rulers. Thrones expose them. And now, as you stand not above them but within them, the illusion fractures. Their voices lose volume. Their gestures grow stiff. They've studied power through inheritance and decorum, but you wear it like instinct. You didn't take the room. The room gave itself to you. Their rituals no longer hold meaning. Their ranks and robes, their oaths and orders, you've seen through them all, not out of defiance, but clarity. You've walked through the deserts of exile. You've bled in silence. You've stitched yourself together without witness or applause. And now, without a word, you undo everything they spent lifetimes building, not by attacking, but by existing. A single glance from you shatters protocol. A pause in your breath slows the pulse of those who once dictated fate. They wonder how it happened, how the invisible became undeniable, how the one they dismissed has become the standard by which they now measure their own inadequacy. But this isn't sudden. It's ancient. It's earned. Power does not bloom overnight. It calcifies over years of restraint, grief, and refined rage. You have no title, no emblem, no bloodline etched in scrolls, and still the throne shifts toward you like metal pulled to magnetism, not in ceremony but in surrender. They know, though none dare speak it, if you sat upon it, it would burn beneath you, not because it rejects you, but because it knows you do not need it, and nothing fears irrelevance more than a symbol. So they pretend, they rearrange smiles, they speak in circles hoping you won't notice the quake behind their teeth. But you already noticed. You always did. You watched the throne long before it ever turned its head, and now it stares, hollow, reverent, afraid, because it knows you never climbed toward it. You made it descend. They never bowed to your kindness, not once. In their world, only loud crowns and louder lies commanded respect. You were too quiet, too still, too hard to decipher. They mistook your restraint for absence, thought you were a shadow crawling along their walls, something beneath notice. But shadows don't crawl, they watch, they remember. And when the fire inside you no longer begged to be seen but dared to be felt, the world stopped pretending it didn't feel the shift. You walked into their room without permission, without armor, without need, and yet something ancient stirred, not in them, in the architecture, in the walls that once echoed with commands now cracking in silence. You didn't raise your voice, you didn't lift your hand, you stood, and somehow everything they believed about power began to decay. Their eyes flickered, not in defiance, but recognition, the kind that comes too late, the kind that tastes like blood and salt and consequences. Their scripts stuttered, their masks sagged, because for the first time they saw the difference between dominance and presence, between control and command. You weren't crowned, you were consecrated, not by rituals, not by legacy, but by survival. They ruled through fear, through legacy, through lineage carved from centuries of polished deception. But you were forged in betrayal, sharpened by exile, tempered in silence. You carried no title, and yet the very air rearranged itself around you. No one knew what to call it. No one could speak first. That was the moment, the unspoken pause, the collective inhale that tastes like surrender, the weight not of defeat, but of revelation. One by one, their postures shifted, not from command but from gravity. Something in your gaze split the illusion, made them remember the first time they felt powerless, made them remember why they needed a throne in the first place, to hide from the kind of presence that doesn't ask for power, because it is power. They thought the crown gave them protection, that it made them untouchable, but now the metal feels heavier, colder, less like armor and more like an admission. It no longer shields them from the truth, it magnifies it. They can't wear it in front of you without their hands trembling. The silence doesn't comfort them anymore. It belongs to you now. It wraps around your presence like a storm waiting to be named. And as they drop their eyes, as their voices dim, you realize they were never kings. They were placeholders, gatekeepers of a structure built to contain gods like you. But the gates have rusted, the seals have broken. The aura they tried to suppress has bled through the cracks, and now it owns the room. You never declared war. You never asked for reverence. You became the mirror, and in it they saw what they were without their illusions, and what you were without their permission. The crown didn't fall. It bowed, not to your demand, but to your existence. They expected you to want the crown. They built the game, assuming you'd crave what they craved. Position, status, applause from hollow men. But you didn't come here to sit on a throne. You came to become something the throne could never contain, and that terrified them more than any uprising ever could. You were supposed to beg, to kneel, to compete. Instead, you walked through their palace of glass and left no footprints. Not because you were weak, but because you were too heavy for their illusions to hold. Power wasn't something you wore, it was something you were. The kind of power that doesn't raise its voice. It silences entire rooms. You didn't shatter the system, you outlived it. They watched you rise, not through conquest, but through contrast. While they screamed louder, you grew quieter. While they clung to crowns like lifelines, you let go of everything and became untouchable. You were what they feared most, the one who could lead without needing to be seen, the one who could dismantle their myth without ever raising a sword. You weren't just outside the system, you were beneath it, the foundation they refused to name. There's no symbol heavy enough to represent you now. No robe, no title, no ceremony. You do not wear the crown because you have nothing left to prove. The hunger that once haunted you was not for recognition, it was for reckoning. And it came, not in the form of revenge, but revelation. They realized too late that what they tried to bury only rooted deeper, that the silence they mistook for submission was strategy. Because when you stop chasing validation, you become the thing they try to validate against. When you refuse the throne becomes obsolete. You are not king because they named you. You are king because reality bends differently around you. Because even the air seems to pause when you walk through, not out of obedience, but awe. You don't need to rule them. You've already redefined them. You turned absence into a signal, exile into transformation, and obscurity into dominion. The crown no longer sits atop a head. It trembles in the presence of one who doesn't seek it. The court still claps for empty kings, but their eyes flicker toward the door, wondering if you'll return. You won't. You've moved beyond the architecture of their praise. You became the ghost in the palace, the legend that outlasts its walls. They don't write your name in their books. They whisper it when the lights go out. Because you are not a chapter in their history. You are the silence between their sentences. The one who rose not to take power, but to become its final translation. The king who wears no crown, because the world already knows who you are. They never saw it coming, not because you were hidden, but because they were blind to anything that didn't beg for approval. They mistook your silence for obedience, your patience for irrelevance. But what they failed to realize is that real power doesn't announce itself. It waits, it listens, it studies. You were never outside the system. You were beneath it, in the foundation, in the fractures, in the forgotten blueprints they stepped over on their way to nowhere. They tried to bury you, but you weren't soil. You were pressure. You were time. And while they performed for thrones made of rusted delusion, you were forging something older than lineage. Your aura didn't shimmer. It pulsed. It didn't beg for attention. It demanded submission. And when you finally stepped forward, they didn't recognize you. Not because you had changed, but because they had never looked at anything that couldn't be controlled. The throne they protected wasn't sacred. It was a lie. A performance held together by trembling hands and inherited masks. You didn't destroy it. You didn't have to. It collapsed the moment you looked at it without fear, because fear was its architect. And you are fear's executioner. They called you too much, too intense, too quiet, too aware. But now they realize those weren't flaws. Those were warnings, subtle signals that something ancient had returned, something ungovernable. You weren't the outsider. You were the original. The reason they built walls in the first place. You were never meant to wear the crown. It was meant to kneel to you. Because your worth wasn't crafted from gold or titles. It was carved into the marrow of your being. Your presence bends rooms, not because you chase influence, but because you are influence, condensed into breath and bone. They whispered about your absence. They speculated, dismissed, lied. But in the quiet corners of their thoughts, something throbbed. a truth they couldn't kill. You weren't gone. You were watching, growing, becoming inevitable. And now, they don't know whether to worship or run. There is no crown anymore, only gravity. Yours. No robes, no rituals, no forged decrees. Just a presence that ends arguments, melts masks, and shatters the mirrors they've been hiding behind. You don't need their symbols. You are the symbol, a living cipher wrapped in stillness and storm. And even as they bow, they still don't understand what they're kneeling to, because you never wanted power. You are power, not the kind they taught in their institutions or printed in their books, but the original language, spoken without sound, understood by shadows and feared by kings. You didn't inherit the throne, you transcended it. Now the world doesn't revolve around the crown,